Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation on grief support, what to expect. We're very excited to have you all join us today on such an important topic. Our presenter today, her name is Taisha Travis, and she is a grief support specialist with Community Hospice. She received her master's degree in social work at the University of Southern California. She's an associate clinical social worker currently working towards her licensure. She has 2 years of clinical experience across a variety of settings, including grief and loss, crisis intervention, outpatient specialty clinics, structured outpatient programs, and residential drug diagnosis clinics as well. Taisha is a wonderful member of our community hospice family, a wealth of resources for our community members. And I know all that she works with praise her for her calmness and the care that she provides them. So Ty, we're very grateful that you're here to spend some time with us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. But before I do that, I would like to remind our participants that if you have any questions whatsoever throughout this presentation, please don't hesitate to enter them into the chat box. I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and I'm happy to stop Taisha and ask those questions for you. We're also going to be recording this presentation. So if there's something that you would like to go back and hear once again, or if there's something that you would like your friends and families to hear, you will be able to find this information on the Community Hospice YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and enter Community Hospice into that search bar, and you will be directed to all of our Community Connections presentations, including today's. So with that, Ty, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you everyone so much for coming and joining us today, giving us a little bit of your time. So in this moment, some of you may already have, or may be anticipating the incredibly difficult task of grieving and mourning. And it's not a task that you wanted. It's not a task that we can truly prepare for, yet it's one that must be done. And for some, grief can be harder than expected. It's hard to know what to anticipate. And so I'm hoping today you get a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of support in the form of education, and I can share with you some of my tips and tricks and information to help you and help guide. Okay, so one of the things that I always talk about is healing being a journey. Grief, in whatever form it takes, is a normal response to loss. And this can be a multitude of loss, death or loss of a home, loss of security, loss of a marriage, a friendship, a pet, right? But no matter what the loss is, grief has physical and mental, behavioral, social, spiritual dimensions. It's a lifetime healing process that over time becomes more manageable with assistance and, of course, the grief work that we do. And I have to confess that while kind of reviewing this slide, that idea of healing being a journey and this wonderful photograph that was chosen for this slide actually spurred my own thoughts on what healing is, especially when we talk about it in the form of grief. And you know, I think that it's hard to explain exactly what that journey is. You know, in this capacity, healing being something that can't be completely done or completed. It's not an event. It's a process. So we can't say once you've reached X, you're healed from grief. And so trying to explain that and finding my own way to put this into words, I have to say, was rather difficult. You know, I'm still learning what that means, you know, through my clients, through myself. And so hoping here that even through this presentation, you can join me in discovering what that journey looks like and where it might actually take you, because it's individual. Everyone's healing journey is going to look differently, feel differently, and lead you to a different place. And so through that, right, and looking at like this man just kind of standing, but who knows where he's going or what he's doing or what he's thinking or what led him to this journey, you know, what's in that backpack. You know, I find that those questions really didn't matter. You know, it was the fact that he is there, and no matter what maybe form of grief could have encompassed his life, he got up, he's there, he's moving. And it really led me to knowing that for me, healing is a little bit more than a journey. It's a learning to yield. You know, as I said, grief is something that, although we don't want and we don't always know how to prepare for it, and we don't always get the chance to, we must feel, you know. And so healing being that willingness to unconditionally accept whatever life is at this moment. And hopefully me and anyone else in your life being able to provide that support, whether you're trying to provide support to someone else who's grieving or you're looking for it for yourself. First, starting with the acceptance. Acceptance being not something that you condone, right? You didn't want this to happen, but it's something where you're knowing that the edges of life are very hard and rough, right? And you're trying to lift that weight a bit by knowing that it's not something that you need to fix. It's something that you're trying to find a way to cope with and manage, but you can't fix this. So yes, I've come to the conclusion throughout this presentation already that for me, healing is learning to yield, learning to surrender, and then deciding exactly what we're going to do about this. And hopefully we can find that out together. So what is grief? What's grief? What's mourning? What is bereavement? Grief, of course, as I mentioned, is that normal and natural emotional reaction to any loss or change, as I mentioned, to any kind. It's normal when you're facing a major life transition, such as grief, not to feel your best at any given moment, you know, to feel chaotic and disoriented. It's a highly personal and vulnerable experience to which I can say across the board, people will, you know, claim many different emotional manifestations of grief, physical manifestations of grief. All to say that with grief, it's so unique to the person that I can say some things that might be common or might be similar to your experience, but it's really going to depend on your relationship with your person, your how they died. You know, it's going to depend on your culture. What does mourning look for you? Whether you're spiritual or religious, do you incorporate that in your healing and grief, right? But overall, one thing that we know for sure is it's a process that's not an illness, right? It's a natural response. It's not something that needs to be medicated or fixed away. It's what we're trying to cope with in this moment. And mourning, right, is that outward social experience of this loss. When we think of grief, we think of internal. What are you feeling? What are you thinking that maybe you don't share with everybody? But mourning being, how does that come out? If you're feeling sad, do you cry? If you're feeling angry, are you yelling? You know, what are you doing to connect what's going on internally to the outside world, right? And bereavement includes both of those things. You are both grieving internally, personally, and outwardly in your social world. And that really is going to be what it is. So some of the many forms of grief come in anticipatory grief. This is occurring before the actual loss, more typically associated with chronic or terminal illnesses or impending life-threatening illness, a diagnosis of some kind. There's no real time frame, but you are anticipating a loss. And again, this doesn't have to be strictly related to death. It could be knowing that you're about to lose your home due to financial instability. It could be knowing that your child is about to go off and go to college. That's a form of grief, right? Knowing that this is coming and it is inevitable. So that's what anticipatory grief is. It's this loss that you know is coming before it's happened, and you know that you cannot stop it in the same breath. Now, some phases of anticipatory grief is really that number one, knowing that this change is inevitable and it cannot be stopped. So, you know, taking it back to that example of maybe an illness or a diagnosis, you've gotten this, or someone that you love has gotten this, right? And maybe we've had to put them on hospice, or we have to start thinking about hospice. And so it's that first initial phase of going through that disbelief and denial, right? This can't be happening. There must be something we can do. We experience that first, is this questioning and this challenging of this news. And then we get to that point where unfortunately we realize that it's happening, and we cannot stop it and we cannot solve it. And then we might move from phase 1 to phase 2, where our concerns and fears are increase accompanied by emotional reactions. Suddenly we're thinking of everything that's going to change, and we are emotionally feeling that too. There's that internal grief and that outward mourning. So you might be thinking, my whole life is going to change. I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I have shorter patience, I have a shorter attention span because I can't focus on anything except my person or this thing that I'm about to lose. And so you have that back and forth between what you're thinking inside and how that's showing outwardly. And then we might move to phase 3, where we have this rehearsal of this loss, right? We start to anticipate and imagine what life is going to look like without our person. If it's dad, we might start to imagining, what's Father's Day going to look like this year if he's not here? What are my kids going to think about having their grandfather being taken away from them? What do I tell them? What do I do? Is it going to feel empty when I go and visit my mom? Right? We start to rehearse those thoughts, even while that person is still here. And that's normal. Right? A lot of the times we might feel guilt for that. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm giving up, like I'm just, right? But it's not that, right? We go right back to phase 1, where we realize that this change, this thing that's happening is inevitable. And now we're right in that cusp of trying to go to acceptance, which, remember, for me, right, what I try to educate on is healing is that. It's not that you fixed this thing or cured this thing that's called grief. You've accepted that this thing is happening. You're trying to manage it and integrate it into your life in the healthiest way that you know how, right? So that's what you're rehearsing. How am I going to keep living even when this happens and I've lost this person that is my core and my foundation? And then we go maybe into that phase 4, right, where you start to imagine life without them. They're not here, so I'm taking on this new role. I'm mowing the lawn. I'm cutting the grass. I'm doing the dishes. I'm doing the laundry. I'm that person. I'm throwing the big birthday bashes because mom used to do that, but I'm going to do that, right? So it's not just imagining life without them. It's also with them in a different connection. So I have this memory. I know what they did, and I'm not going to do it exactly like they did, but I'm going to do it, right? And all of this happens before that person has gone. And in the same way that as a griever, and someone who is going through these phases has that, it can be said the same way for the person who is also experiencing having this terminal illness, right? Dying, going through how are they going to survive without me? What are they going to do? Are they going to know how to handle this and that? And so one thing that's really can be so important when you're going through anticipatory grief is communicating, making plans, having set ideas and solutions to problems that maybe you're worried about or you're scared of, and talking that out with your person, right? Creating this moment of communication and connection in that way so that you know how you're going to better prepare and handle for when they do leave. And so it doesn't take away the grief, right? If after they've died, you still feel all of the manifestations of grief, that's normal. Anticipatory grief does not stop or substitute grief. It just helps you to get to that point of acceptance a little bit faster, a little tiny bit, but you're still feeling that grief. You're still feeling the emotions that come with it and the subsequent losses that come with it. It's not a cure, but for some people, it can help them get to that acceptance a little bit faster. So again, how do we cope? Be honest with your feelings. Talk it out. Don't keep it in the internal, right? Seek out support, whether it's therapy or grief counseling or just a friend on the phone, or talk to your person. Ask them how they're feeling. How are you coping? What do you think? Connect with them. And of course, seek moments of joy if you're caregiving. Seek moments of joy just having some time with your person, creating as many memories as you can, because as much as grief is focused on after death, anticipatory grief can also focus on life. it can also allow you to make new memories and keep those as you transition. Some other types of loss throughout the life cycle that people will and maybe already have experienced: death, both sudden and anticipated, right? That anticipatory grief, divorce, relocation, changes in schools or job, changing grades, right? For kids, that's a form of loss for them. They might lose friends. If they go from 7th to 8th grade or 8th to 9th, they might lose that sense of routine and stability. Friendships that end can bring a form of grief, especially depending on how that friendship ended, right? Was it amicable? Was it more traumatic, scary? Pet loss, sense of a loss of normalcy. So again, getting a different diagnosis, a disability, a mental health diagnosis, things that disrupt your equilibrium, right? They have disrupted what you know to be normal. And now you'll suddenly find yourself having to readjust and repurpose into this whole new world where you never thought you really would, and you weren't prepared. Those are the things that can bring about loss, right? Loss of health, miscarriage, retirement. So it's really important not to disenfranchise our grief, or not to compare, right? One is not worse than this, right? For you, you might feel that way, right? This is the worst thing that I've ever experienced, this divorce, right? And so it's important to honor that feeling and not dismiss it or push it down or say, I really shouldn't be feeling this way, right? Don't shouldn't yourself in any form of loss. Don't shouldn't yourself, because it stops you from feeling what you need to feel, thereby coping and accepting. So it's really important to recognize what form of loss are you experiencing and validate that loss. So 5 things to keep in mind with grief. So we can't get over it. The only way to deal with grief is to experience it and do that grief work, which is so hard. It's not easy, but it's very possible. And not comparing your grief to others. Remember, not having that disenfranchised grief, that comparative grief where you're saying, well, these people all have it worse, so I need to stop grieving, right? I need to get it together, right? Things that we think we're telling ourselves to be strong are actually much harder to do, because you can't just get it together. There are so many components of your grief that it's hard, And so the most troubling grief there is your own. Always know that. Successful grief work isn't done alone. And I do want to amend this, because while we don't want to isolate ourselves, because of course that can make this grief process and going towards that acceptance very complicated, and it can delay that healing. We also can make time to be alone if that's needed. It can be really overwhelming to constantly be around other people, because when you're grieving, you might be emotionally exhausted and you might not have the compassion to give to others at this moment. And so if you're finding that, and yet you're forcing yourself to go out and connect, it's okay to take a little step back and say, I need some self-care time. I need some alone time. I'm going through something very difficult, and maybe I can't share in that joy that you have right now. I can't share in that sadness that you have right now, but I can at a later time. So, isolation is what we're trying to avoid, but there's a difference between isolating and needing a little bit of space, needing a little bit of recoup time so that you can build your energy back up, because grief has honestly worn it down. It's repurposed it in all these different areas that maybe you just don't have that space to be around so many people all the time, and that's okay. Or maybe you can't do that 1-hour phone call every week with your best friend, right? It's just so much. Maybe you need it to sleep. So keep in mind that, while it's very important to do your grief work, that can be both with someone or alone. We just want to make a very healthy balance. How we grieve, again, is strongly influenced by our culture and spirituality. So when we talk about comparative grief, I'm going to bring this up a lot. Looking at how someone else is grieving. Remember, grief is unique. It's so important not to try to compare, right? Well, that person lost her husband too, but she's not crying as much as I am. Am I doing this wrong? No, you're not. You're doing it in the way that you need for yourself, and that's okay. We have tips for how to get through it, but if you find something that works for you in a healthy way, that's okay. If you find that it helps you the most to cry for 10, 15 minutes, an hour every day, and then you're done crying and then you can go to the grocery store, that's okay, right? If you find that you don't cry at all, that's okay, because maybe that means that you're moving your pain in a different direction. You're showing how you grieve in a different way. It can be creative. It can be art, music, painting, going to visit the cemetery. It can be in all these different ways. So, just because someone looks like they're doing kind of well in their grief, right, doesn't mean that they are not feeling those same emotions of sadness and despair and just confusion, and right, it just means that they're looking and dealing with it a little bit differently, right? I know that for myself, in my own family, my father's side of the family is Ghanaian. So his mother, my grandmother, they have fantasy coffins. It's where you shape the coffin into the hobby or animal that your person loved. It's usually a way to express their personality, right? And the reason that they do that is because it keeps their passions alive, right? So it's this, beautiful, working together, we're making this coffin, we're going to bury it, right? It could be a dog or a pony or a guitar if they like that. And so typically, on my dad's side of the family, if they're grieving, they're smiling, they're smiling and they're happy. But maybe from the outside looking in, people might go, oh, are you really grieving? You're not crying. It's not that. They've transformed that sadness and that fear and that loss, and they are building something, honoring their person that they've lost in this very cultural way, because we believe that it's similar to Earth, that death is not the end. And so we want our person to be able to take their hobbies, their passions on to the next life, and we have our own honor in that. So that's what I mean when it's different depending on your culture and spirituality and your relationship with that person. So that's why it's really, really important not to comparative grieve, because you really don't know, and find your own way of grieving. What works for you and your person, and how are you going to honor them? So there's a fun tidbit for you from my family. And it's also important to know that there are waves of grief. It comes and goes. There will be times that are more okay, right? You might have more energy. And then that time you might go, okay, I can call you at 12 o'clock tomorrow. I can do that. And then maybe tomorrow 11:50 comes and you go, you know what? I am feeling this grief. I'm sad. And I just don't have the emotional capacity to have a full conversation. Can we reschedule? Right? That's what that might look like. It might look like I was doing so well, and then I got hit with this grief. And usually we see that with special holidays or dates or anniversaries. But sometimes it can just hit you, right? It could just hit you because it's grief. And you've realized again that your life is different. And maybe for a moment that just kind of knocks the wind out of you and you need to recoup. That's okay. It's normal for it to happen. Doesn't mean that you're failing in your grief. It doesn't mean that you're not doing something right about how you process. That happens to everyone, right? You remember that as much as you love your person or whatever this loss that you're going through is, that's how much you're grieving. And it doesn't always hit you at once, right? There's sometimes these little realities in the day that remind you of your grief, and that's when it hits you. Like when you wake up, that person might have a harder time waking up in the morning because maybe their person did a morning ritual with coffee and they wake up and that's not there. They don't smell the coffee, and that wave of grief hit, right? It doesn't mean that, oh, I'm going to go all the way back to square one. I have to do this again. It just means in that moment, they felt that sadness again. They felt that loss again. And it might kind of just make their heart ache. But that's normal, that wave of grief. We cope with it as best we can by getting up, and maybe we make that coffee ourselves, so we can have that smell. We do the thing that they did for us. But I do want to emphasize how normal that is. And it doesn't matter if it's been a year or 3, you can still get a wave of grief. Some of the phases of grief, I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with the Kubler-Ross model of grief on death and dying. Denial, having that shock and that disbelief, numbness, anger and rage, bargaining, sadness or depression, and acceptance, right? And it's really important here to emphasize that these are not set in stone, right? This is not the end all be all for grief. As I've said before, it's different for every person. Some may not even have anger or rage. That might not be something that anyone experiences, right? It doesn't mean that they're not grieving. This is really more of a dial where you can kind of identify where you might be at any given moment, more of a guide rather than a strict, this is what you're going to experience. Right? That denial might last longer for others, depending, again, if it's an unexpected loss, it just happened and it was sudden. That denial will last longer than if it was anticipated for some people, because it takes them longer to try to deal and adjust to this world without the person. It takes them longer to deal with any unfinished business or words that they weren't able to say. They didn't ever get that ability to anticipatory grieve, right? That never occurred for them. So that denial, that I can't believe this is happening, I can't believe this is my life, really might last much longer, months longer, right? So that's what makes that different. Sadness is not depression. And I do want to have that caveat. Sadness can lead to depression if it's this chronic, complicated grief, right? But there is a big difference between grief and depression. They look similar, but typically with grief, like I said, you'll have those waves, those up and downs, but you will have moments of joy or peace or comfort, right? With depression, it's a chronic, unending despair. For months and months and months leading to years and years, and you never hit that acceptance, right? You are almost continuously in shock. You don't go from shock to this to that to this. You're just in shock, and it's hard for you to accept this is happening for longer periods of time. And if that's something that you're feeling, like this pain is persisting, this acute grief is going and going and going and going, and you can't get out of it, that would be a really good sign and a good time to reach out to, again, a grief counselor, a therapist, and maybe a doctor to try to get that settled, because we might be talking about complicated grief or depression, right? So that's one of the biggest identifiers on that. And like I said, not everybody's going to go through all of these stages. They're really phases. You can go back and forth, right? There might be a day where you have less shock, and there might be a day where you feel nothing but shock or numbness, right? It just depends on what your day looks like. So it's really important to do that grief education and start to learn what grief really is, not just as a whole, but for you as a person. And let others know. So again, some of the manifestations of grief, we see it physically, changes in sleep, appetite, decreased energy, difficulty with concentration, problem solving, memory. I can't tell you how many times I'll have a client who just says, I need you to write this down. I'm going to take notes because I'm going to forget 5 minutes after. And they'll say, I never had this problem. My memory was sharp and top tier, right? It's not that. It's that right now you're thinking of everything that's changed, everything. Your whole life is about readjusting. Perhaps you're having to learn things that you never thought you had to learn financially, a different role, a different chore, something that honestly is desiring your attention a little bit more, your concentration a little bit more. And so you do need to write down just fleeting information or information that changes on a regular basis, because it's harder for you to keep that in, right? So that's really normal. So I do see a lot of times list making or alarms or reminders being used in that acute grief moment, because you can't remember, or you can't retain information like you maybe could. And that's not to say that it will always be that way, but at least I'd say at least the first year, it's going to look like that. Just because the first year, everything is so different and new, and you're struggling with the emotional component of grief, that how are you going to know when different information comes? Or if it was 10 o'clock instead of 11 o'clock, or if your appointment got changed, that's why it's important to write it down. So not to be so fearful of that if that happens for you. Emotionally, just being tearful, right? Or opposite spectrum, being really stoic and numb, or seemingly looking like you don't care, kind of having a flat affect, not having that ability to show a range of dynamic kind of facial expressions, being so focused on what you've lost and having those increasing concerns of how are you going to manage this and what is this going to look like, maybe guilt or anger. So all of the emotional components about grief also manifest. Spiritually, a lot of the times just feeling like you don't have a purpose. Perhaps you're a caregiver, right? And your person has died and you feel like, well, what's the meaning of life? What do I do? What's my new purpose? That was my job. I took care of that person. I loved them. I did everything for them. Now what? Right? You go into a state of confusion, and that shakes you to your core for a bit until you repurpose and find out what's next on your journey, or how you can take that caregiving characteristic and use it in a different way, right? It takes a little bit of time to get there. Socially, remember, it can be really isolating to grieve, but it can also be really overwhelming. You feel like, oh my gosh, if it's a big group, or if you're just jumping back into work, it can be really overwhelming to do. Or you feel like you just want to be alone, or you're having difficulty connecting with your friends. Those things can definitely impact the social aspect of your grief. So the 4 tasks of mourning. So Dr. William Morden kind of balanced off our Kubler-Ross, which again, that was more meant as a guide. So now we go into okay, if we don't know exactly what it's gonna look like in grief, well, what's the task? What's the goal, right? What's the purpose? How do we know when we're healed or accepting, right? So number 1, to accept the reality of the loss, right? That's one of the most important and the biggest task that we often struggle with, is not logically. We all know logically this has happened. It's waking up and feeling like you can't move, right? And feeling like you can't go on. You're not motivated to continue in your life. And so that's the task, is accepting that this has happened, yes, but also accepting that you are alive, and what can you do? What are the action steps that you want to take with your grief alongside you? You're not forgetting your person. You're not leaving it behind. You're taking them with you as you live, right? That's what you're trying to accept. That this new world is happening without your person, but you can bring them along in a different form, in a different connection. What serves as your anchor, right? So that you can accept that this has happened and move forward with it. And that also includes being able to experience this pain. So going from numbness to slowly feeling those emotions is really common, right? So all of a sudden, you're starting to cry more, you're starting to be more agitated or irritable, or you're starting to have memories that are good or bad, right? That make you feel like you just want to numb it out. No, I don't want to, nope, distract yourself, and you overwork and you take on all these tasks because I don't want to experience this pain. But that's a task, right? That's a task that we must do, because when we experience that pain and we accept that this pain is here, then we can adjust. Right? Then we can do number 3. We can adjust to an environment in which our person is missing, right? That separation anxiety that will not resolve itself. Then we start to learn how to adjust, because we've accepted that this has happened. We have experienced that pain, and we have mourned outwardly and grieved inwardly. And now we're trying to adjust to this world. We're trying to make it both in honoring our person, right? Or whatever that loss is. Remember, it doesn't just have to be death loss. We're honoring that and still moving forward with our life, right? And So then we withdraw our emotional energy solely from grief being the forefront, and we reinvest it into other relationships. So we start to move forward with our life and our grief. So we're taking that energy that maybe we were using just to grieve, and we start to see it spread out. And that looks like maybe you're calling your friends more, answering those phones more, right? Maybe you're emailing more, sending letters or cards. Maybe you're going to the gym. Maybe you're going on walks. So it's not just here. You're spreading out that energy a little bit more. Another task of mourning that it's not on Dr. Warden's task, but we do add it, forgiveness. That might be a task that you will need to do, is outwardly forgive, whether it's yourself or your person, right? If you feel that you have immense anger, or there is this rage that is stopping you from doing the other task, maybe we need to throw forgiveness in there, right? So those are our tasks of mourning. Having a healthy support system can really be beneficial to you. Dr. Catherine Shear stated that grief is the form that love takes after someone you love dies. The point isn't to put these feelings behind you altogether. That's not possible or even desirable. The point is to gain perspective and help grief find its rightful place in a person's life. Having that connection with your person and having that connection with yourself and your friends and your current, right? Your present, you're integrating, right? So you're not trying to forget. You're not trying to necessarily stop grieving. It's the intensity, of course. You don't want the insomnia and you don't want the inability to eat. Those are things you're trying to work through. But the grief itself, well, that's love, right? That's that love that just doesn't have a place to go. And so we're trying to find a place for it to go, right? And so we're trying to gain that perspective and help find its place, whether that's in a memory box, right? Whether that's in a memorial, right? Whatever suits you culturally, feels right for you as an individual, that's what your support system will be. Okay, so it's so important to stay connected with others. And again, always with a balance. If you feel like you need to balance and have a little bit of alone time, otherwise known as self-care time, that's fine. But continue to stay connected. Check in, or let your friends or family check in on you once a week instead of every day. If you don't like it every day, or you like it once a week or once a month, or something where you can still, oh, okay, this is how I'm doing. You can still talk, you can still express. It's personal safety. It helps to normalize grief to have that healthy support system. And again, it doesn't have to be just friends or just family. That healthy support system can be a grief group, right? That can help to validate your grief, normalize the manifestations that you're having, and develop healthy coping skills to deal with them. That's why we want to continue to talk to people, even if it's not as frequently, or if it's frequently. We just want that go-to. It helps to promote that healing process. It helps to promote that acceptance of this is happening and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk. I'm going to express my feelings. I'm going to go out safely. And I know so much of that has changed with COVID, but with things like webinars and Zoom like this, we try to stay connected as much as we can. If we're being safe or vaccinated, we do our 6 feet apart. We can still go on walks. We can still pick up lunch and bring it back home where we feel safer, and we can eat outside if it's a pretty day like it is today. There are things that we can still do to have that healthy support system. And it really helps to avoid the isolation, and it helps to decrease the risk of complicated grief. It gets you out of your head, right? It takes the grief that you feel, which, remember, grief being internal, and we move it to mourning, which is outwardly expressing. By nature, by doing that, we are kind of transforming our grief, and we're taking that first step into the acceptance. Okay, so some healthy coping skills for grief. Remember that grief is a process, not an event, right? And healing is a choice. You have to be willing. That's it. That's one of the most important steps. You have to be willing to go towards healing, allowing yourself to do that. Crying, right? Self-care, trying to take good care of yourself, eat right, sleep, exercise, walk, get up, stretch, even if it's yoga, even if it's for 5 minutes, do something for yourself. One thing for yourself 5 minutes a day is self-care, right? Mindfulness and relaxation, guided meditations. There are so many on YouTube that you can do if that's something, or you can just take a class, right? Or you can just deep breathe all on your own without having a guide. Just sit down, go outside and breathe and listen to music. Whatever puts you in the present moment and relaxes your body and stops it from tensing up so much. You can talk with others, spend quality time with family and friends in any capacity, right? Whether that's Zoom, on the phone, taking a small trip, safely, of course. Journaling, that's huge. Writing can help connect what we feel and think to the world around us, right? It can also help to have, again, groups where you can validate one another and feel that back and know that what you're experiencing is normal, right? As long as we avoid numbing, right? Alcohol and drugs and grief avoidance, those are things that stop us from dealing with our grief and managing and coping and moving forward, period, right? If we block everything out, we're not just blocking out all the bad feelings and bad memories, we're blocking out all the good ones too. And so it's very important to be conscious and aware of that. And being persistent. Like I said, grief is a process, not an event. There's not going to be this one perfect time where you say, okay, I'm good, I'm fine, never going to grieve again, I'm never going to cry again. However, it will lessen, right? The frequency that you do these things perhaps will start to decrease, and you'll start to see yourself finding new joys and creating that new memories and grief. Grief is quite complex. You can feel both sad and happy at the same time. It doesn't mean you're not grieving. It doesn't mean you don't honor your person. It means you're doing both. You're honoring them and integrating them into your life. It's not the focus, right? But it's still there. It's just kind of moved to the back. And so be persistent with the grief work that you do. However you choose to do it, be persistent with it. If it's walking every morning, because you know that that's the only way you're going to take a shower and get ready for the day, always walk in the morning. Right? If you have to avoid it for weather reasons, then try to replace that for 5 minutes with something else, right? But just be persistent. And of course, seek professional support and education as needed. One of the most validating things that can come of the grief work is grief education. Knowing what to expect, like I said, knowing what might happen or different ways other people find to cope really help support you in your individual journey. So seek it out, watch videos, talk to people, do groups, Facebook groups, seek out others who may be going through what you're going through. And if you can't, seek out professional support, right? Therapy or grief counseling, something that helps you to manage. Okay. So ways to memorialize your loss. We can do celebrations of life, memorial services throughout the year, photo albums or memory books, balloon release, candle lighting ceremony. We can plant a tree or any flower, roses, or creating a little altar in our home, whether it's making a favorite meal or planning special days or pre-planning special days. All of these are ways to memorialize loss. Really what we mean when we say that is connecting your present with your person, right? With your loss. So I know the holidays are coming up. Pre-planning, what do you think that day should look like? Can you set out a plate, for your person that's missing? Maybe you can write out recipes on that plate that they would have loved, right? And talk about him or her, so making their favorite meal on Thanksgiving, right? And again, this isn't not to cry or not to feel grief. It's to have a place to do it. It's mourning, right? We're saying, I miss you so much. This is how I'm going to keep my connection with you. I'm going to look at these photos. I'm going to look at these pictures. I'm going to do a balloon release and write a note to you and give it to you, right? I'm going to write a letter to you. Whatever works for you. Like I said, my side of the family, we do fantasy coffins, and we build them and we kind of give them this celebration of life, seeming kind of thing. So some signs of healing and or acceptance, right? You'll know you'll be beginning to heal and accept when you're remembering with less pain. It's more of a nostalgia, or it's more of a good memory. It's coming with a different sensation of happiness or gratitude versus just that pain and that anger that comes with it acutely when you're first experiencing grief. You're feeling this gratitude with it this time around. And you're more hopeful about your future. You have maybe reimagined what your future is going to look like, and you're taking steps to do that. You're able to form new meaningful relationships, whether it's new friendships with people who are also grieving, whether it's new work relationships, you've maybe gotten a new career, just something where you're putting a little bit of your energy into that. You're repurposing your energy. You're freely expressing your feelings. So maybe you can talk about your person more, right? Maybe you're able to express when you're angry or sad or hurt or confused more easily than you did before. You're not trying to stop it or numb it or be strong, right? You're just able to express it, knowing that that's okay to do. Develop a sense of self and a new normal, right? That new normal. You're repurposing what life means for you. You're finding your own version of meaning now. Like I said, if you were a caretaker, maybe you're finding that you want to caretake for someone else, or maybe you want to teach others how to caretake. Maybe there were things that you really wish that you could have done, and now you can teach that to others who are maybe just starting their caretaking journey, right? How can you transform those feelings of pain and loss into something of healing and moving forward? Not just for you, but for others maybe. If you start finding yourself thinking like that, it's very possible that you're in some signs of healing. But remember, if those waves of grief come, even during all of this, that's okay. That's normal, because our grief doesn't ever really go away. It doesn't mean we'll never, ever feel sad again. We're just feeling it less frequently, less intensity. But there might be some times where we hear our person's favorite song and we might shed some tears. That's okay. So of course, community hospice grief support services is always open to the public. We do individual support, family grief support groups, this time, of course, via Zoom or phone. And we have our Camp Erin and school-based grief support, virtual. So anytime that you feel like, okay, maybe after this presentation, I feel like I might need a little support, give us a call. And we want to help you in the best way that we know how, myself included. Okay, any questions? I hope I didn't overtalk.
Hi, Ty. What a great presentation. Thank you so very much. I know I was certainly touched by it, and there was a couple comments that it was a great presentation. At this time, we're going to take any questions. So I know that there are some of you that have joined us today. Please, if you have any questions for Ty or comments, please enter that into the chat box. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much for the comment and for joining us today. Is there anything else?
I am good. No.
You are good, Ty. You are so good. There are no questions. Okay, Ty, can you move to the next slide for me, please?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Perfect. All right, so if there's no further questions, then we're just going to go ahead and close. I'd like to invite you to all join us for our next presentation, which will be on caregiver burnout. That will be on September the 22nd at 12 o'clock. You may use the same link that you used today to join us. Again, September 22nd at 12 o'clock, and that's on caregiver burnout. Just a reminder, this presentation will be on our YouTube channel if you would like to see it again or share it with your peers. We hope that you do so. And with that, Ty, again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate it. I know it was just a great presentation and a lot of great resources. So with that, we wish everybody well. Take care, and we hope to see you guys again. Thanks so much.